So with that, I'm delighted to welcome everyone who's joining us today. As I mentioned, we have been having a fascinating conversation of the past two events about the just transition. Those of you who've been able to attend will know that we've talked about issues such as the scope and possibilities for addressing energy poverty, the opportunities to bring new voices into the transition and open up opportunities for marginalized groups, and the need for expansive solutions and dialogues if we're able to successfully transition to the new green economy. And it's on that basis that we'll be going forward today. But before we get started, I wanted to pass to my colleagues, Frank Marchetti, Minister Councillor from the Embassy in France, and Gerhard, the Embassy of France in Ottawa, and Gerhard Schlaudraff, who's Deputy Head of Mission for the Embassy of Germany. Thank you.
Thank you. Madame la Ministre Vargon, Monsieur le Ministre O'Regan, Chief Clooney Adamek, Monsieur le Secrétaire d'État Thomas Lossmüller, chère Diana, my German colleague and I are indeed very delighted to welcome you virtually to the French Embassy in Ottawa for the final panel of this series on just transition, entitled Our Zero Carbon Future and Sticking the Stock. The first two webinars had identified solutions to fight energy poverty, précarité énergétique, we say in French, to accompany workers, industries, and territories towards a green future. And this last panel will be an opportunity to take a step back and wrap up the solutions developed by Germany, Canada, and France, but also to highlight the areas where progress still needs to be made. For this high-level discussion, we are very honored and pleased to welcome our French Minister for Housing, Mrs. Emmanuelle Vargon, who will present our vision and policies to support the just transition in France. We are also very honored and pleased to welcome Canada's Minister of Labour, Mr. Seamus O'Regan, Regional Leader Clooney Adamek, and Mr. Thomas Lossmüller, former State Secretary and lead candidate for the SPD in Germany. And before I hand over to my colleague Gerhard from the German Embassy, I would like again to thank you all for your presence and to wish you a very fruitful discussion.
Merci Franck et bonjour à tous. We are very happy to have you all here. Just so shortly after COP26, we have never been more committed to pave the way for a just transition, which is essential to achieving our climate goals without leaving anyone behind. We do these seminars with an idea in mind, which is to have a good exchange of best practices between our countries and across the Atlantic. We think these exchanges are crucial to succeed, and we hope we'll, from the discussion today, we can also draw some lessons for our future work in 2022. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the collaboration. We'll now get on with the main business. As many of you who've been here before, I don't think you need to be reminded, but please do type questions into the panel. I will try and integrate those as we go forward. We're going to start with a short presentation or a discussion points from each of our panelists, which were very usefully introduced to you already by my colleagues. So I'm going to go first to Herr Lossmüller, and he is presently, as was mentioned, he's presently campaigning for the Social Democratic Party of Germany for the office of Prime Minister in Schleswig-Holstein. He had started his career at the World Bank in the Young Professionals programs in Washington and in Africa. He was Chief of Staff to the Premier of Schleswig-Holstein before, And from 2017 to 2021, he was manager for transformation processes at EY. So he has a very varied background. I think I'm going to introduce the speakers one by one so you remember who they are before they speak. So let's go straight to you, Helos Müller.
Thank you very much, Diana, and hello, everybody. Yeah, a very interesting topic and on the top of all of our minds. Here in Schleswig-Holstein, you need to understand, so we are one of the 16 Länder. We are the most northern one, just bordering on Denmark. And we already experienced this transition in terms of at least energy supply. We used to supply quite a bit of electricity to the rest of Germany from nuclear power, which we already decided to exit a couple of years ago and replaced it by renewable power. Wind, in fact, is a product that was developed here in Schleswig-Holstein. So the first big wind turbines that were built in the world are on Schleswig-Holstein soil. Many of the early technological developments come from here. And now already for many years, we are producing more renewable energy than we are actually consuming. And this has been a very interesting experience also in terms of a just transition, because we moved from centralized power supply essentially run by big power companies towards a decentralized system where individual landowners, individual farmers were able to build up these wind turbines, and with the subsidy system that we implemented with the feed-in tariff, which already has been also a world export from Germany, this created quite a bit of wealth. Some of the regions in our state are amongst the fastest growing in Germany. They moved from relatively rural backwater kind of areas on the sea towards economic powerhouses, generating wealth for people there now to invest in new technologies around renewable energies. And it's very interesting case studies. You can even see within the region that just transition really relies on the question how local communities are participating in this wealth generation. So in the more northern parts, landowners and farmers that invested in wind turbines approached this from a community basis. So they invited people from the villages around to co-invest in the wind turbine developments. And this has really kind of led to broad spread wealth. In other parts where we also have a lot of wind energy, they didn't do that. And immediately you see there's a lot of conflict around, for example, the acceptance of wind turbines in those regions where you did not have this commitment, and a very kind of broad acceptance and legitimation of this energy transition in the other parts. So there's lots of interesting learnings. And also in terms of, local people in these regions often are minorities. Because we are this border region, we have a large Danish minority in Germany. We have an established Frisian minority here who were landowners. So they were part of that exercise, and especially those kind of closer knit communities were those communities that then spread wealth because they invested communally in these energies. But I think looking towards just transition, it's not only about energy transformation. We are now looking, and I understand you discussed this in your previous sessions, but the really more challenging part for us is now, how do we transition industry? How do we transition mobility? How do we transition heat and warmth in buildings, which are much trickier questions. One of the kind of points I want to make, because this is an international discussion, is that one of my fears is that because we are now committed to climate reduction. In Germany here, we have a federal law that essentially prescribes that we will be climate neutral by 2045. The Constitutional Court here just ruled that we have to underpin these with concrete measures to actually exit faster, so not only to backload everything to the next generation. So we will do this now, and we will do industrial transformation, and we will help industries chemical industries, steel industry, which is still very important in Germany, to transfer and transition to clean technologies, which is costly. And we will subsidize the way from one technology to the other. And one of the worries I have is that we will also need to think about protecting these industries if we don't manage to establish a fair and just transition modus around the world. So in protecting labor and protecting work here, our interest is that the companies investing will have a fair and level playing field with other companies. And we can only achieve that if we are sure that this is happening around the world. And if this is not happening, and if there will be a price differential, for example, for steel, we will have to think around border adjustment taxes, new tariffs, so deglobalization, which I think is dangerous for all of us. So just transition is not only a question of local participation, it's also a question of global policies, fair trade, and of course then, and this I think is a point you already made kind of in the introduction, there's a lot of learning we can have amongst regions with huge and very interesting experiences here in Schleswig-Holstein that we're very happy to share. What we need this kind of, this framework and a global thinking at the same time.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. That was a really great introduction, emphasizing the need for learning, but also the, the challenge of doing everything all at once, all these industries. We've got a limited period of time and we need to make progress. I'm now going to move to France, Minister Vargon, who's Minister Delegate to the Minister of Ecological Transition in charge of housing. She joined the cabinet in 2018 as Minister of State to the Minister of Ecological Transition and Solidarity. And she is former Chief of Staff to Martin Hirsch, who's the High Commissioner for Active Solidarity Against Poverty. And in that role, she oversaw the implementation of the Active Solidarity Income. She also previously worked as Danone's General Manager in charge of corporate social responsibility. Most of you will know that Danone is a leading corporation in that space. So doubtless she was ahead of the crest of the wave, coordinating Danone's commitments to health, environment and inclusion, and being involved in climate and agricultural strategy. So again, really broad, fantastic expertise to bring to this discussion. So Minister Vargon, please do come in now. Thank you.
Thanks, Diana, for this great introduction. Hi to all the panelists, Mr. Minister, Mr. and Mrs. Ambassadors. I would like to join in the discussion with a testimony of the topic in France, because of course, ecological transition is a big challenge for us in France as elsewhere, and just transition is an even bigger challenge. And we had this experience for real with the crisis end of 2018 and beginning of 2019, called the Gilets jaunes, the yellow vests in English, in which we had a very strong discussion between institutions and people about how to get the transition fair and how not to privilege either fighting against the end of the world or helping people to make ends meet till the end of the month. And that was really the topic, and it was about the carbon pricing. So it was really, in real, the theoretical questions we wonder about how to make the transition fair, how to make the transition just. So since then, we moved forward with a few insights. We moved forward supporting strongly on the international agenda the need for a fair transition. We welcomed the G7 in France in 2019, and in Metz, we had a declaration into the G7 saying we need to get this transition fair, leaving no one behind. And we were part of various coalitions at the COP26 with Germany, with Canada, saying the same thing, signing the UK declaration about the same topic. So this is for the general declarations. But then I joined the previous speaker about what do we do concretely. I think we have three levels, three ways of acting. The first is showing the economical benefit of the transition through investments and jobs. This is what we tried to do in the recovery plan in France after COVID. And this is also what we are trying to do in our forward-looking transition plan of the French economy, which is called France 2030, showing massive investments. We are committed to invest a little more than 35 billion euros in 10 years in key technologies helping for the ecological transition. And in these technologies, hydrogen, low carbon, plane, a new material for building, we try to show the benefit in job creation and prosperity. This is the first insight. The second insight is about the social consequences of what we are doing and how we protect a low-level and mid-level households when we try to move forward with the transition. We set up a convention with 150 citizens who were summoned to help us design measures to help with fair transition. And we took a lot of their measures. In my topic, we are heavily subsidizing the ability to renovate private households, private houses, so that we are sure that we give the people the money to invest in renovation of their homes, which is of course good for the planet, but also good for them. So we are trying to support economically households, not only the very low income one, but also mid-class, to make sure they are able to follow us in the process of transition into new technologies and change of behaviors. And then the third topic is very much what Thomas said previously about local contracting and local support. We have to work with local authorities because it's not only national, it's not only international, it's also very much local. I was in charge of realizing the closing of our last 4 coal electricity plants. We have only 4 left in France. We are a bit ahead of Germany on that topic, not on all topics, of course. But even if we have only 4, for the 4 plants, for the hundreds of people working there, you are still coming there and saying, we will close your facility because we need to move forward and get out of electricity, out of coal. And this is very difficult. So we work on local contracts to make sure they have a new job, to make sure we attract investors at the same places, to make sure transition is a real word with real consequences, positive consequences for them. And we try to build on these contracts, generalizing ecological and recovery transition contracts all over the country. So these are the 3 insights I wanted to share with you. And I say it with a lot of humility because it's built out of a crisis.
Thank you so much. Whenever this topic comes up, I think everyone, their mind instantly go to France and that experience, which, as you said, was a crisis, which you were able to overcome with these measures. But I still think it creates fear in other countries in terms of moving forward. So perhaps Canadian minister will address that later on. I will point out at this point, unfortunately, Mr. Vargon has to leave a little bit early. She will be here for questions, but not till the absolute end. Thank you so much. We're now going to move to Canada, as it were. So I'm delighted to welcome our 2 Canadian participants. So we have Regional Chief Cloanie Adamek, and she is she is a proud Northerner and citizen of the Cloanie First Nation. She is the first Assembly of the First Nations Regional Chief and the Yukon region and lead on climate change and the environment, youth and modern treaties, so wide remit. And she's the youngest ever female regional chief. As the Assembly of First Nations lead on climate change, she succeeded in establishing the environment as a top priority for the organization and a key contributor to international conferences and within the global environmental conversation. And most recently, she served on the advisory board to the advisory body to the Minister of Environment and was co-chair of the COVID-19 Northern and Remote Communities Working Group. So we're really delighted to have you with us, Regional Chief Adamek, and love to hear your perspective.
Thank you, and good morning, good afternoon, wherever you may be. Danj a Kluwani Adamek uye dachlwe di ayahat geyo hatu asawg ganach chish ta'an ganach chish kwanlandan. So as was mentioned, my name's Kluwani Adamek, and I'm from the Dachlwe di Killer Whale clan, and a proud citizen of Kluwani First Nation, and of course a proud Northerner. Important to share, of course, my mixed ancestry, and in this case, very much connected to the discussions as it relates to the international connections that we have. I come from Tlingit, Southern Shoshone, German and Irish ancestry, and so certainly have reflected upon the fact that my grandparents would have never probably connected or met in their lifetime. And so when we talk about reconciliation, my grandmother went to residential school and my grandfather fled Germany after the Second World War. And so certainly a history of resiliency is one that has continued to guide me both personally and professionally. But as it relates to climate and the importance of holding and creating space for traditional knowledge and for the Indigenous worldview to really help guide the solutions. So when we talk about fair and just, and we look to the north, the Northern Hemisphere is of course impacted at a rate 3 times higher. And I can tell you for certain, all those who are listening, I'm Kluwani Lake and very Googleable. You can take a look at the water levels and how they have decreased about 10 feet. So when you're driving to this beautiful part of my territory, and you know what was this beautiful blue-green is now turning into this sand silt, because the glacier has of course receded to a point where it is now going down the other side of a mountain. And for some, when we talk about climate and the environment, we talk about net zero, we talk about fair and just. I find a lot of the time the experiences of people on the ground are often not included in the conversation. And so how do we create more spaces? And do want to acknowledge at COP, the Indigenous Peoples Working Group. This COP, I chose to stay home because we are going through a state of climate emergency as well as a COVID state of emergency, and come from a very small community. And so the risk of travel during this time, while these international conversations need to continue, have often reflected on what really happens at these international meetings. And certainly when it comes to those who are like-minded, are easily able to connect, but it is very challenging to help others understand what we're talking about when we talk about wanting to achieve net zero by 2050 and the critical role of Indigenous leadership in reducing carbon and what that discussion looks like. And so what I find oftentimes we overlook, and it is so important to look at the planning and look at ways in which we can continue to support the economy. At the same time, are we really looking at the root causes? And when we talk about the net zero planning, not as an end state, but as a restorative process towards a more just, equitable, and resilient future, it really does require a foundational shift to the way in which we see and the way in which we live and the relationship that we do have with the earth. And I acknowledge that to some that might seem very fluffy, but that's the reality that we're in. As human beings, the innate connection and the relationship to land. I shared with you that I come from the Dachlwe, the killer whale people. There are stories that go back over 10,000 years. And now we look at anthropological and geographical evidence to bring truth to, in a Western context, those stories. My dad was told a story from an elder that said, "Grandson, you need to be ready for when Kluwani Lake becomes a river." And here we are in 2021, where we've seen, the lake drop 10 feet. That impacts the way that we fish, that impacts the way that our young people are connecting to the land. And so it is all about also reconnection. And I feel that that part of the conversation may seem to some be what is described as fluff. It's outside the scope on the periphery of talking about issues like impact to economy and how do we bring everyone on side. But the reality is, as human beings, we have become so far disconnected from who we are and that innate relationship that this just transition also requires Indigenous voices and rights holders to be part of all of those conversations, whether they be global, whether they be regional, whether they be national in scope. And so I do want to acknowledge, my federal colleague, Seamus O'Regan, and his colleagues who have worked hard to take steps. But we are at a critical time where if we don't balance traditional knowledge in the way that we look to creating a net zero future and being able to build for 7 generations ahead, then we are going to continue to make the same errors and be in the same position that we're in right now. And so I really look forward to hearing additional reflections, and certainly happy to have ongoing conversations from a worldview perspective and how Indigenous knowledge systems and climate leadership are critical in, of course, advancing a more equitable, just, and responsible future. So the question that certainly I would leave to all those of us who are listening and beyond is, what kind of world will we be leaving behind?
Thank you so much. That was a really powerful intervention. This thread has woven throughout our series, and I think it's really critical now. If we need system change, we need to, as you suggest, we need to do things entirely differently. And the things that we can learn from Indigenous communities in Canada or elsewhere. And we're fortunate to have you to share that knowledge of many millennia with us. So finally, we're now going to move to the Honourable Seamus O'Regan, who is Federal Minister of Labour, as you know, in the Government of Canada. He was first elected as the Member of Parliament for St. John's South, Mount Pearl in 2015. He's previously served as Minister of Natural Resources, Minister of Indigenous Services, and Minister of Veterans Affairs, as well as Associate Minister of National Defence. So like everyone else, he has really, really great experience to bring to this debate, and we're delighted to have him here today. Welcome.
Thank you, Diana. And I am joining you today from the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe peoples. And thank you for the kind introduction. I think when you invited me, I was at that time Minister of Natural Resources. Now I am Minister of Labor. But I can tell you that the passion and the drive and my mission remain the same in this role. Regional Chief, it's good to see you again. I haven't seen you since I was last in Yukon, and I look forward to getting back. Thomas, Emmanuel, real pleasure to have you here. And we're gathering virtually, but I don't think there's any doubt we're finally coming on the other side of this pandemic. Canada is one of the countries leading the world right now for first and second dose vaccinations. I think we're just behind South Korea. Very proud of the fact that my home province, Newfoundland and Labrador, has reached a significant milestone. 90% of those eligible fully vaccinated. Very proud of that. I come from Newfoundland and Labrador, and I grew up in both. They're very distinct places in the same province. You grow up to be a very practical person. And that is, I think, how people there have confronted the pandemic, and I think it's how they're confronting this transition. I'll get into that in a little bit. But just to say that without question, this pandemic has changed the world. I mean, first off, here we are appearing with one another virtually, and this is normal. It's also, I think, brought a laser-like focus on the challenges that we faced even before COVID entered our daily lives. I mean, challenges as significant as climate change. The world is demanding climate ambition, and we heard that loud and clear from leaders in Glasgow, and we heard it from the streets of Glasgow, loud and clear. What I was impressed by, I think, in Glasgow, more than previous COPs, was the variety of people who were there and the leaders who were there, not only from government anymore and science, but more broadly from academia, from industry, from the market, from labor. And everyone honed in on the same goal, net zero. Failure is not an option. Climate is changing. There's no more debate. It's changing the communities around us. most especially in the north, as the regional chief is aware, and a place where I grew up in Labrador. The Inuit there and the Innu incredibly aware of what they're seeing before their eyes, and it is forcing them to adapt and change, and it will force all of us to adapt and change. We're seeing those impacts right now in BC, in floods, British Columbia, floods that are ripping apart families, communities, roads, bridges. It's temporarily cutting off our largest international port, the Port of Vancouver. A lot to talk right now around the world about supply chain issues. These are connected. And the decisions that we make domestically, internationally, locally, as Emmanuel brought up, in confronting our greatest challenges today, that is going to determine the legacy that we leave to the next generation. And as the regional chief brought up, many generations beyond that. I think it's a challenge that we are up to. I think we are capable of doing this. I think Canada's climate target is ambitious, but it is required. It is achievable. It certainly passed muster during the election campaign, when from various quarters, and not all of those that would traditionally be praising of us by any means, gave us top marks for it. I think over the past 6 years, we have worked hard to put Canada on the right path, but we have to get ambitious. A path to reduce emissions in a way that makes sure that all sectors and parts of the country can participate and thrive. Now, I have no doubt we're up to this, because I believe in the men and women who work in our natural resource sectors. And these are workers who do the impossible. They beat the odds. It is what they do. Rising above challenges is in their DNA. People out west in Alberta and Saskatchewan, they managed to figure out a way to pull oil out of sand, and in a generation and a half turned us into the 4th largest oil producer in the world. They took oil in the North Atlantic, which ExxonMobil now calls the harshest environment that they operate in the world, and become global leaders at it. It is knowledge and expertise that is sought out around the world, because they are talented, they are educated, they are inventive, they are relentless. And I look at them now and I say, we are retooling. I am proud of what you have accomplished and built. It's the job that we set out to do. But now we need that drive and determination and ingenuity to lower emissions wherever we find them. You know, the men and women who have built this country and our natural resources sector, they're in St. John's, you know, where I'm from. They are my neighbors, my family, my friends. In Alberta, in Saskatchewan, and British Columbia, they have built entire communities, proud, prosperous Canadian communities. These workers will not be left behind. They will be at the center of Canada's clean energy future. In fact, they will lead it, because without them, that future doesn't exist. Because who do you think is going to do it? Who the heck do you think is going to be doing the hard work of lowering emissions and building up renewables? This is complex stuff. This is complex engineering. We need them. We need all of them. And our energy future will be inclusive. It has to be, because I am of the firm belief, I've said it many times, when you include everyone, you get the best. And we need the best. Women, racialized persons, people who identify as LGBTQ2, people living in poverty, people living in rural and remote communities, people living with disabilities, and our leaders in First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities across this country. So here in Canada, we're doing the work. We're sitting down with workers, with labor, with industry to develop a path forward. We're investing $185 million in coal workers and coal communities so they can develop new skills and diversify local economies. We invested $2 billion through Budget 2021 for worker skills training, creating almost 500,000 new opportunities for Canadians to prepare for the work that they want. We committed during the election campaign $2 billion to a futures fund in our platform for Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Newfoundland and Labrador to create regional specific strategies for their provinces for this transition. We're investing in the clean energy industries of the future, from hydrogen to renewables to batteries to modern grids. We got to get this right. We have to minimize the disruption for workers and consumers to keep them on side in urgently and effectively combating climate change. Full court press. And getting that done in Canada looks like apprenticeship and training programs, being specific about local needs, making it easier for workers to move and to find work across Canada, to match their skills to the jobs available, to make sure that our EI system meets the needs of people in a changing economy. We got to do all that. And I know it seems like a tall task or serious tasks, but you know, we don't shy away from challenges in this country. We're Canada. We're ambitious. It's what we do. Thank you. Thank you, Dan.
Thank you, Minister. That was really, again, really rich and broad. I'm very conscious that we're going to lose our Minister Vargon very soon. So I'm going to start the questions with her and go back to this issue. You said you were responsible, you were working with closing down the last remaining coal plants in France. France, as many people may know, signed up to the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance at COP26. It was Quebec signed up to it actually from Canada, but it was one of the few countries that did sign up. Does this all suggest that the government there feels confident that the types of measures that you have described, the local movements, the climate assembly, the investments in subsidies for innovations, etc., do you feel that that is sufficient to bring the public along when things get difficult? And I think that this is the conversation that we have to have. I mean, there is a good future out there, but it is not going to be a smooth transition to that future, and it will be difficult for people. So I guess the question is, you know, how confident are you that everything you've done is going to avert the possibility of another set of yellow jacket protests going forward?
I will start with what was just said about failure is not an option. We know how much the responsibility we all have is heavy, and we have to act under this responsibility. And we have both to be very clear in what we say in national and international forums, and also make sure that what we say is translated into acts, because this is probably one of the most important challenges we all face from our public opinions. You are talking a lot in a lot of places, but you don't act. This being said, I think the process is about pioneering, mainstreaming, and then putting obligations in place as far as the general public is concerned. Pioneering meaning showing with demonstrators that you can change for the best. It's true with industry. It's also true with public behavior. You have to show that you are making changes possible, even if it's for a few people who are really keen on going forward. And it's true about closing factories or transforming factories, and it's also true in general behavior, that it's possible. Then you have to mainstream. And it's probably very difficult, probably one of the most difficult part of it. Make sure that you go from a few pioneers who are really keen on the topic anyway, who are going to buy an electrical car, even if it's more expensive, who are going to undergo major transformation in their homes because they can do it economically and they are motivated to do it, to mainstreaming average households, making it possible. So it's about money, but it's also about information, advice, support, change behavior. It's about making it simple. And we all know, and it's true in private companies and it's true in public government, that making it simple is the most difficult thing of all. And then when you have done it, when you have a significant part of the population who follow you, not only in the speech, but in the acting, changing the way they buy, changing the way they act, changing the way they go from one place to the other, changing their point of view about having houses renovated, then you can come with obligations. And it's true also with the closing of the last plant. First, we discuss, we negotiate about how we transition, and then we set up the legislation saying that after some time it will not be legally possible to produce electricity out of coal in the country. But pioneering, mainstreaming, and then putting in place obligations is, I think, the best way to get it done. And if you go too quickly from one phase to the other, you take the risk of losing part of your public opinion and getting people thinking you submit them to constraints as you have not provided enough solutions, enough in intensity and enough in simplicity. So yes, I think there is a path. For electricity production, we have a very decarbonated electricity production anyway in France. So we are not really typical, but we have the same problem as everybody with cars, with houses, and so on and so forth, with agriculture, of course, because transition about agriculture is going to be a main topic also. So maybe if we try to work on pioneers, mainstream, and then obligation, we have a way out, a positive way out of all this.
Thank you so much for that inspiration and your own clarity on the topic. And we've been grateful to have you with us today.
Thank you. I'm sorry, I have another meeting in 10 minutes, so I have to leave. But my staff is staying to listen to the discussion of the panel and discussion with everybody, because it's really an interesting forum. So thanks a lot for inviting me.
Thank you. So with that, there's two topics that I want to address, and there are many questions for which I'm very grateful, and I'm trying to pull out from some of them. One is this issue of clarity, and there's many comments about not having a clear pathway forward in Canada. There's questions of how much support is still going into the oil and gas industries while we're trying to do other things. In Germany, obviously, when you forwent nuclear, coal is a big issue in Germany. So there is a lot of contradiction apparent to the public in the choices that governments are making. And we heard the appeal to simplicity and clarity. And I think that is not always evident. So that's the one side of the question. And the second one is about how much time we have. I mean, my argument is that COP got us into a relatively better place. If we had an additional 30, 40 years, I would be relatively optimistic and calm. But the issue is that we don't have time. And all the things that you've described, or many of the things that you've described, are complex processes that could take a lot of time. And the regional chief, I think, has made great points about bringing Indigenous people into this. What I'm wondering is whether we can do everything in the way that you're suggesting and also do it in a timely fashion, because we really only have a decade or so to turn things around. So those are the two kind of areas of questioning, and I'm going to bring in Herr Losser-Müller to give us the answers.
No, I am an optimist on all of this. First of all, I think it's quite important in terms of the justice discussion, what the regional chief said, that we have two justice discussions here. One is climate justice in the sense, justice towards people that are affected by climate change. And I sympathize heavily here because Schleswig-Holstein, we are a coastal country. So we will lose a third to a half of the land that we live on if sea levels rise. That is the justice imperative. At the same time, we have this question around justice in transition. Look, for 80% of all technologies, we know what the carbon neutral alternative is. So it's not a knowledge problem anymore. It's a scaling up problem, and it's an investment problem right now. We know that once we are through the transition, the level of wealth we will have is exactly the same that we have right now, because capital doesn't really, is not really interested whether it's invested in coal and oil or whether it's invested in renewable energies. The problem is the transition. There will be winners and losers, and the winners need to compensate the losers. That's what the Minister Wagon Emmanuel was talking about in terms of dealing with coal plants. We're doing exactly the same in Germany. Those are costly programs in terms of them building up, restructuring local economies around coal plants, and actually coal mining as well, which was still big in Germany until now. We have the same question in terms of car manufacturing, which, as all of you know, is a big industrial topic in Germany. And we need to deal with those workers, offer them skills upgrades, invest in new production of different products for those people that were working on fossil fuel engines, simply because the electric motor is just not as work intensive anymore. But there's a different level. And I think this is a question of compensation. This is a question of policies in terms of skills, upskilling, bringing new skills. It's also a question of unionization. So one of the big worries people have, for example, in car manufacturing, is that they will lose jobs that are in, where we have good labor relations, which are there's a clear kind of contracts, and the new jobs that are being generated are in service industries that don't have this kind of contract. So giving that kind of security will be important. But there's another level, and this is the question of transitioning of the individual to a carbon neutral lifestyle. One thing that we're not very good at anywhere in the world right now is understanding that lots of this is around public infrastructures. So if you take heat and the way that we are generating warmth for buildings, and there's two ways to go now. One is to make every single building energy efficient and replace the heating system with a renewable system, a heat pump or something like that. That's very expensive. And that's what people are afraid of. And that creates a lot of injustices. But at the same time, Denmark is a good example. We have this alternative of building collective infrastructures in terms of supplying heat from much more efficient sources, which is a lot more cost effective. So justice here becomes a question also of putting the burden on the individual or organizing better ways collectively. Same with charging infrastructure for e-mobility, and so on and so on. So we need to make choices here around this. And a fourth level of injustice is actually a fascinating problem. Renewable energies are cheaper. So decentralized energy production. If you put on an average household in the world, if you put photovoltaic system, solar energy on the roof and a battery in the house, that system will generate cheaper electricity than if you take electricity from a large grid, which is very costly, and a large central power plant. The social justice problem is this investment of buying that big solar panel and the battery is big. It's too big for individual households. So only rich households get cheap energy in the future. That's where we need to look at. So a lot of the transition problems are around enabling individuals to invest in their climate-friendly future, which in most cases actually will be economically beneficial. So either kind of do this by collective infrastructures or solve this investment gap at the start that only that poor people will not be able to live climate friendly and have higher costs at the end.
Thank you so much. I want to bring in the regional chief now for some, any reflections on what Herr Lossemüller said, but also this, how are communities, your communities are really seizing the opportunities. We've heard, some of your communities are seizing the opportunities to move forward, to generate renewable energy and to solve a number of problems at once. But there is also a lot of attention being paid to groups that historically have done extremely well and have been subsidized, and they are holding up the transition. And some could argue, I'm being provocative here, while you're working and your communities are doing the best they can, but you're still waiting for the rest of the country to sort of support that really fully, I would argue. Does that resonate with you?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's something that was said earlier by the minister. We're going from trying to simplify, going from hard to simple. And in the past, and our elders have talked about this, it was a simple life, but a very hard life. Like if you were to suggest that people have to carry their water every single day and to, keep your fire lit to stay warm all winter, right? Like these are I mean, put me in the bush for 2 days alone, like that, I would be very nervous about that. Maybe one night I would feel comfortable to be able to rough it, so to speak. But the point is that things have shifted so quickly. And when we look to as you know, Indigenous people being stewards of the land, you know, we did pretty well for the last 10,000 years. It's only been really in the last 500 years that we've seen some of these shifts. And really what we're talking about is a people problem. We're talking about the ways in which development has moved, the way that the economy has shifted, especially for Indigenous peoples, from a wage-based to, or rather from a trade-based to a wage-based economy. Like if we look to the history, and I'm speaking very much from a Canadian lens right now, if we look to that history and then the ways in which Indigenous peoples were not included, then we're looking right now at to your point, what then is happening and what then has shifted. And there are communities that have led. There's the Indigenous Circle of Experts, the ICE committee, which is a committee of primarily you know, technicians and experts, but it also creates space for young people to come forward with their own ideas, to come up with their own projects in their communities. Because what's going to work even in the north, what's going to work in Nunavut might not work in the Yukon. We're dealing with, you know, geographically very different parts of the north. My community, for example, if you go to our First Nation government office, we've got solar panels everywhere. That's great. But to, you know, our colleague Thomas's earlier point, we're also seeing this huge divide with the ability for people who have, you know, equity or capital to put into clean energy solutions, that we're not seeing perhaps those opportunities be more far spread. Yukon government, for example, just made a huge investment in electric cars in the Yukon. And I'm like, explain to me how this is going to work in a long-term sort of situation when we still have so many of our own communities that are still on diesel, right? Like this, is this the step that we really need to look at, or do we need to start to partner and build? And so I think to that point, you know, are we really enabling individuals, or are we really thinking about the collective? And I think that that's where the worldview of us needing to look at the collective and being able to support from a place of, whether it be different ways of looking at building infrastructure. I mean, look at what's happened in BC right now, in the province of British Columbia. It's not necessarily really talked about that the Sumas Valley was actually a lake that was, you know, sort of emptied, if you will, drained a number of years ago. And now, of course, we're seeing in a moment where there's way too much water, naturally the water is going to go to that lower point with respect to drainage. So I think that this is where we need to find those ways to both support Indigenous peoples to continue to lead these solutions, but where are we coming up with those opportunities as it relates to capital and investment? And how are we looking to things like infrastructure banks being able to really partner and be required to do so in a different way? So those are some of the, I think, reflections that I think are really important to share. And again, to the point that we don't really have time, we don't have time. And it is going to require heavy lifting. It's going to feel really uncomfortable. And I think that as human beings, if it doesn't impact us, it's a lot easier to just sort of like turn away and not really address the issue. But I think that we're at a point in time now where we need the collective to understand how important it is that we make these shifts. It's beyond recycling at this point in time. It's beyond making sure, right, that you're only using certain types of products at home. Like, this is a fundamental shift in how we live and how we look at the world as human beings. And I think that that's something that you know, is going to require a whole lot more than commitments to electric vehicles and to coming up with new innovation and new technologies.
Thank you so much. We're nearly out of time. I'm going to go to the Minister now. You haven't had the benefit of being in all these events, but you've heard what's said today. And you know, one of the things that struck people during this series is how much Canada relies on sort of incentives and not so much on regulation. And our German and French colleagues have relied much more on regulation to achieve their goals and the kind of things that we've been talking about. There's a number of comments in about how Canada, what Canada talks about, but what Canada actually does. And I just want to ask you, what you've heard today that you think you could really learn from, Europe. That's the idea. What sounds interesting? What excites you about really moving forward to create a just transition in Canada?
No, most certainly. I haven't had the benefit of sitting in all the seminars. So I would say, Diana, maybe I'll just make a few comments, but I will preface those comments by saying quite clearly that to point out obstructions is not to be obstructionist. And there are certain things that are lie before us that will be fundamentally challenging. And I point them out, not to say let's wallow them or hold up our hands and say there's nothing we can do. Now, I've never done that, actually. I mention them because these are the challenges we must surmount in order to achieve the targets we must achieve. I firmly believe that. But it has been pointed out, and I actually somebody said in the chat, I think Gigi I was reading said, ambiguity is inevitable, perplexity is a killer for civic action. I would say, and I'm not being poetic, I would say, look, consistency is alluring until your light bill doubles. And that is a problem for a lot of people in this country. So it does look, Diana, to your point earlier about, there being fundamental contradictions about oil and gas on the one hand, but a government that is committed to meeting our targets and committed to climate change. We look at President Biden, who, is unlike any other president in history, I think is completely committed to climate action and is just, is passing fundamental legislation in the House. And yet at the same time is asking OPEC to open the floodgates. And everyone goes, well, what the heck's going on? What's going on is winter. And people in a democracy who continue to rely on these energy sources. So the transition itself takes time. Does it need to happen urgently? It absolutely does. But we still got with this winter to look after, and maybe the winter after that and the winter after that. I in Newfoundland and Labrador, we've barely handled a situation that politically has been dominating our politics provincially for about 12 years now. It is a hydroelectric project called Muskrat Falls that is now well over double in its price. And who was meant to pay for it? The ratepayers. They would have seen their bills double this month, double. I have seen the statistics about how many tens of thousands of people in a province of 500,000 that would have thrown below the poverty line. It's all I've worked on, really. It seems to me, I've worked on a lot, I should say, but for 2 years, this is all I've done. And that is what happens when big energy projects come before our ability to pay for them, or we look to ratepayers or to workers to pick up the slack. If you shock them like that, you'll lose them. So our big challenge in a democracy, it's not a challenge that some other countries have, but in a democracy, and we've seen it with Gilets Jaunes, I've seen it with Muskrat Falls, we saw it with Alberta and getting our party being shut out in 2019. I've seen it with Aaron O'Toole saying in the last campaign, well, if we can't meet these targets, let's lower the targets. We'll meet those. If we don't meet people halfway, they will find people who are less ambitious and get them to lead. So there's no panacea. These conversations, which I hope to be a part of again, will continue to be complex, but they must move forward. They must move forward, not in fits and jerks and steps forwards and steps back, but effectively plodding on every single day. It is not going to be easy, but it has to be effective. It has to be real.
Thank you. That is absolutely clear that it is not easy, but it must happen. And I think we're all certainly agreed on that. So I'm going to pass now. I want to thank you all for being here, and I hope you don't mind my frank questioning. I'm now going to pass you to Toby, Corporate Knights CEO, for a final roundup.
Thanks, Diana, and I'd like to thank all the speakers. Thanks for bringing into stark clarity the reasons why we need to move more rapidly, but more important, the reasons why we can and how we can move more rapidly now that the gravitational forces are aligned with climate solutions in our economy. So I really appreciate your words, Minister O'Regan, and Minister Wargren's words were really helpful. And Regional Chief Clooney, Adamek, thanks for bringing your wisdom and that long-term perspective, even though we're moving rapidly in the next 10 years, really being conscious and mindful of what that means for the next 7 generations, because that feedback loop will be so critical. And Thomas, thanks for bringing your wisdom as well. Really appreciate the support and cooperation of our partners on this, the embassies of Germany and France. And Diana, thanks for so deftly guiding the discussions throughout this series of the Ottawa climate talks around our common zero carbon future. We have lots to do over the next 9 years, and we really look forward to working together with you. All of you participated as audience members in the chat and questions. This is only going to happen with the engagement of a critical mass of folks like you, and so we really appreciate your engagement. And we're looking forward to speeding up and looking at every investment decision that we make as a public institution or private company, going through that climate and justice lens, so that we can all move together faster and make it to 2030 in a much better spot. So thanks kindly, and have a great week, and see you soon.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Toby. Thanks, Diana.
Thanks.